Let's talk about miasma theory. Miasma theory? I say miasma. How do you say it, Chris Goulet?
Miasma. Now
Sure.
this is a Mazda product,
Hmm.
right? It's a convertible,
Yes,
if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it's the next step up from the protege.
I see. I see.
Um, so it is stating in basic terms that sometimes air is bad, which is true of
It's a
all things.
broad statement, but hard to argue with.
Yeah. And sometimes breathing in that bad air will make you sick. So the big thing to remember is that air itself can sometimes be bad enough to make you sick. Not the things that it is carrying, but the air itself.
The
And this is the most of this talk is going to be kind of centered in the Victorian era, the early 1800s.
Okay.
But this is a very ancient hypothesis. The image on the screen right now is Hippocrates famously saving Athens from the plague, which is all it's known by, the plague,
The big
by
one.
setting some cleansing fires.
Hmm.
You can read about this in Thucydides, and you should also remember that it did not happen. Hippocrates, the person, was not at Athens during the plague, which really did happen. And there is some interesting kind of scholarship on what the plague was. We still don't know. It was probably typhus, but there's not really any evidence to say one way or the other. And you should also remember that the setting of the cleansing fires, which probably did happen because this was a mainstream theory at the time, did not save the Athenians from the plague. Things like herd immunity did. So, just kind of setting up what miasma, what this theory is, we can move a little bit more forward into, oops, hit the wrong button, into the Victorian era, where cholera and typhus were just kind of ravaging urban centers in Europe and also North America. Um, so the people during this time, they thought that all plagues were brought about by bad air, and the images on the screen are talking about war, kind of sweeping across the area and bringing the foul smell of death and gunpowder into camps and bringing on cholera epidemics, and typhus epidemics and dysentery. But it was more likely that the close quarters, questionable water sources, the fact that people are getting shot or stabbed are all around were more likely the cause of those things. Sanitation was
Okay, wait.
also big. Yeah.
I gotta stop you. I have another monkey question. So
Okay.
what? So I'm trying to like wrap my head around what people were perceiving miasma to be, and it's described as bad air, right? You say
Mm-hmm.
it's like the so I'm trying, like, what were they pointing to that was like, oh man, here comes miasma, like
Right.
I can tell that this is miasmatic, and we've got to get do something about this. Was it like, I don't know, was it just like the existence of something stinky? Because knowing what I know about relative, hygiene and sewer systems, septic
Yeah.
systems of the time, it feels like, that might be a difficult attribution to make.
Definitely. So what you have to remember is that when these big plagues are happening, both in the ancient world and in the Victorian era, they are happening in dense urban centers. So, with dense urban centers, you have the accumulation of wealth, obviously, you have affluence, but you have lots of effluence as well. So, people are relieving themselves, garbage is kind of piling up, and bad smells are kind of constant at this time.
So is
In the
everything miasma?
Well, to them it was. Foul smell specifically could be a precursor for disease, but it could also have been like a wet air that kind of suddenly comes in. So, like a humidity that comes in during specifically the spring or the fall, which would also tend to bring on seasonal fevers that time. But the thing to remember is that it is not necessarily the air itself that is doing it, but the air could be bringing things in that are infecting people. And since these are densely packed areas,
Mm-hmm.
so think about London during the Victorian era or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a Napoleonic military camp, people are basically living on top of each other. So while the foul air definitely didn't make people healthier, and we will talk about that in a minute, it did not necessarily bring in respiratory diseases like cholera
Right, right,
and
right, right.
typhus.
That yeah, just trying to wrap my head around what it is that they thought that they were experiencing.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, no
with
one likes to smell the Yankee Candle Company has made a multi-million dollar business on things should smell nice. I don't know if they've linked that back to miasma theory, but we still have things like aromatherapy,
right, right, right.
and essential oil diffusion and things like that. And that is a little bit linked to miasma theory. So it is still partially, they might not realize that they are kind of linking themselves back to this ancient Hippocratic and Galenic medical theory, but they might be. Um, so the other big thing, and the other picture on, it's on my right. I don't know if it's flipped or not in the stream, but you have something pointing at sanitation, which was not great. Like I talked about, sewage was just kind of dumped into a waterway, and the water source may or may not be downstream from where the sewer was dumped into it. Garbage just kind of piled up and was taken care of eventually. Um, Most cemeteries were right in the middle of town. Urban centers got more and more dense as industrialization came to them. And industrialization tended to be in the urban centers rather than now you kind of see it away from a residential area. So, not a lot of zoning boards were in play in the Victorian era. Uh, a big takeaway, the sanitation argument was also a way for the ruling elite to just exert some good old fashioned classism. Um, it was the wealthy areas that would be sanitized once that effort started to come about. But there were efforts for sanitation, and while they were completely wrong that putting sanitary actions into areas would stop respiratory illnesses,
Mm-hmm.
they definitely were wrong in the best way possible, right?
Sure, that's failing successfully, as it were, falling upward.
So before we move too far forward, we have to look at kind of older versions of personal protective equipment. And on the left, you see the very evocative Renaissance plague doctor. And this was specifically in the Italian capitals of the Renaissance during the bubonic plague. They would wear a waxed leather outfit, including hat, pants, shoes, gloves, hat, that big overcoat, and the easiest to spot is that beak looking mask that the doctor's wearing.
Because they were
And that,
trying to inspire enough nightmares to scare the shit out of you
right.
enough to get the disease out.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness gracious.
And that beak was stuffed with potpourri, basically like camphor and flowers and really strong smelling things, so that as the miasma would work its way up to the nose of the doctor, it would be sweetened with these smells and therefore, I guess, rendered less potent. I do not know the statistics in bubonic plague doctors that contracted bubonic plague. I tend to think because of all of the other protective equipment they're wearing that it was probably pretty low. However, I do know the statistics kind of on their effectiveness in combating the plague, and they are extremely poor.
Get out
They
of
would,
town.
yeah,
You put
they
a
were
potpourri
basically
mask on and
statisticians.
assume that you're not going to catch the flu. Things are not going to go well for you.
Yeah, they basically acted as statisticians. They would go in and count how many people had the plague
Mm-hmm.
and then how many people died from said plague. And eventually, the plague would kind of die out in the area and they would be like, oh, it's gone now. You're welcome. And they would get large sums of money directly from the city in which they were working for their efforts. So really interesting. And, anyone who's played Assassin's Creed 2 has spent lots of time talking with plague doctors. The other one is a lot less effective than this outfit. I mean, they were not actually doing anything by stuffing camphor into the beak of that mask, but they were protecting themselves by having a waxed leather cocoon that they were covering themselves in.
Oh, I don't know. They were inspiring an entire generation of obedient children, I'd say.
Yeah. And also, like, the steampunk outfits that are plague doctor centric are just amazing. So take a few minutes after this and Google that, and you will not be disappointed. The Victorian Veil Hat, while it was probably less terrifying, was not very effective at doing much. The thought was that it would stop dirt from hitting the person's hair and skin, but you could also perfume it so that it would stop foul air from getting to the lungs. And I'm sure that if you ran a statistical report on how many people wore veil hats and didn't get cholera and not link it to the fact that they were living in wealthier, more spread out areas, you would not find that they were very effective at all.
But darn, were they fashionable.
They were. I would be personally for either of these looks coming back.
I've definitely got a bias toward one and not the other.